Don't move, just trust me. The whisper wasn't a request. It was a cold, low vibration that crawled against Nkechi's skin, smelling of expensive tobacco and the midnight Seoul rain. Nkechi Dimma had spent 6 months in this exclusive club perfecting the art of being invisible. She was the shadow in the crisp white apron, the silent server that the elite of the Shinguk syndicate never looked at. Until tonight. Tonight, she saw the briefcase she wasn't supposed to see. She saw the flash of steel in the hallway. And before she could even breathe, Ji-eun, the man they call the King of Shadows, had her pinned. His intricate neck tattoos leaned in close, his piercing, dominant gaze locking onto her wide, dark eyes. In that moment, the entire room didn't just go silent. It froze. Nkechi is caught between a silver-tipped bullet and the most feared man in Korea. Is he pinning her down to silence a witness? Or is he the only thing standing between her and an assassin's strike? Before we see why the king just claimed a waitress in front of his greatest enemies, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single second of how the invisible server became the Mafia's only obsession. To the Shinguk syndicate, Nkechi is just the help. They don't know that 6 years ago, the name Dimma was royalty in Lagos, Nigeria. They don't know she fled to Seoul to escape the ruins of a family empire that was burned to the ground by corporate greed. Nkechi came here to disappear. She worked double shifts and kept her head down, sending everyone back home to restore her father's stolen honor. But as she stands trapped against the wall by Ji-eun's powerful frame, she realizes her cover is blown. The man holding her isn't just a boss. He is the heir to the very power that destroyed her past. And now, he's whispered the 4 words that will change her future forever. Just trust me. But in a world of blood and silk, trust is the most expensive thing you can give. In the humid, neon-soaked pulse of Seoul's Gangnam district, Nkechi Dimma had mastered the art of being air. To the elite patrons of the Obsidian Lounge, she was not a woman with a ruined family legacy in Lagos or a degree she couldn't use. She was merely a pair of moving hands, a crisp white apron, and a silent shadow that kept the crystal flutes filled. Nkechi lived by a strict set of rules. Eyes down, shoulders square, and never, under any circumstances, make eye contact with the men in the velvet booths. In this city, visibility was a luxury she couldn't afford. Each one she earned was a brick in the wall she was building to protect her parents back home. A slow reconstruction of the dignity they had lost when their import business was liquidated by unseen forces years ago. The air in the VIP wing was different tonight. Thicker, charged with a static that made the fine hairs on Nkechi's deep brown arms stand up. The scent of expensive cologne and vintage whiskey was underscored by something metallic. As she moved toward the private alcove at the end of the hall, the usual low hum of jazz was replaced by a suffocating silence. She reached the heavy mahogany doors, her fingers tightening around the edge of her serving tray. She was supposed to deliver a vintage bottle of Sulla and vanish. But as the door creaked open, the art of being nobody failed her. The room was bathed in a bruised purple light. At the center of the table sat 3 open briefcases. They weren't filled with cash. Instead, stacks of decrypted hard drives and thick, stamped ledgers lay exposed like open wounds. In the center of it all stood Ji-eun. Even from the doorway, his presence was a physical weight. His black, slicked-back hair caught the dim light, and the intricate ink crawling up his neck seemed to pulse with his controlled breathing. His fitted black shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the sharp, angular line of a jaw that looked carved from stone. Nkechi froze. A crystal glass on her tray rattled, a tiny, traitorous sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Ji-eun didn't jump. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply turned his head, his narrow, dark eyes locking onto hers with a piercing, dominant gaze that stripped away her invisibility in a single second. In that look, Nkechi realized she wasn't looking at a businessman. She was looking at the apex predator of the Seoul underworld. She had seen the one thing she was never meant to see, the architecture of a global takeover. The tray trembled. The invisible server was gone, and in her place was a witness whose life had just become the most expensive debt in the room. The rattle of the crystal on Nkechi's tray felt like a tectonic shift, a crack in the carefully constructed wall of her anonymity. Across the bruised light of the VIP lounge, Ji-eun didn't blink. His dark, narrow eyes remained locked on hers, pinning her in place more effectively than any physical restraint. Around the table, 3 other men, shadowy figures with faces like jagged glass, reached instinctively for the holsters hidden beneath their tailored blazers. The air in the room didn't just chill, it solidified. Nkechi's breath hitched, her lungs suddenly too small for the heavy, metallic atmosphere. She began to take a frantic step back, the white of her apron a target in the dimness, but she wasn't fast enough. In a blur of black silk and predatory grace, Ji-eun was across the room. Before she could gasp, he slammed one hand against the mahogany door frame behind her, his other hand gripping her side with a firm, assertive pressure that forced her back against the cold marble wall. The scent of rain, expensive tobacco, and something dangerously clean enveloped her. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that skipped down her spine. "Just trust me." The room froze. The gunmen halted mid-draw, their expressions flickering from lethal intent to pure, unadulterated shock. Behind Ji-eun's shoulder, his right-hand man, Choi Hyuk, stepped forward, his hand hovering over his weapon. "Boss, she's a witness. You know the protocol for the Shinguk group." Ji-eun didn't turn around. He leaned in closer, his sharp, angular jawline inches from Nkechi's face. She could see the intricate black ink of the tattoos crawling up his neck, disappearing into the slicked-back undercut of his hair. His intensity was a physical weight, a dominant gaze that demanded her absolute stillness. "She isn't a witness," Ji-eun said, his voice projecting across the silent room with a terrifying, quiet authority. "She is mine." The proclamation hung in the air like a death sentence, or a stay of execution. Nkechi's heart hammered against her ribs, her deep brown skin flushed with a cocktail of terror and a strange, dizzying heat. She was a waitress from Lagos who had spent months trying to be a ghost, and now, the most feared man in the Seoul underworld was claiming her in front of a room full of assassins. "Out," Ji-eun commanded, never breaking eye contact with Nkechi. "All of you." Now, one by one, the men retreated, the heavy click of the door signaling their exit. Nkechi was left alone in the bruised light with the Mafia king, his hands still firm on her side, his body a golden cage that offered the only protection in a world that had suddenly decided to see her. The heavy, tinted windows of the black sedan swallowed the neon glow of Seoul, leaving Nkechi in a pressurized silence. Beside her, Ji-eun remained a statue of dark silk and sharp angles, his presence radiating a heat that felt like a physical weight. He didn't look at her, yet she could feel his dominant gaze tracing the pulse point in her neck. When the car finally slowed, it wasn't at a police station or a dark alley, but before the towering iron gates of a fortress hidden in the hills. This was the Shinguk estate, a sprawling expanse of glass and stone that looked more like a modern museum than a home. As the doors opened, the humid night air was replaced by the clinical chill of the marble foyer. Nkechi felt small, her waitress uniform and stained apron a jagged tear in the fabric of such opulence. Standing in the center of the hall, hands clasped with surgical precision, was a woman whose very silhouette commanded submission. Mrs. Kwan, the estate's manager, wore her hair in a bun so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her face into a permanent mask of disapproval. Her eyes, cold as winter hailstones, swept over Nkechi's deep brown skin with a clinical detachment that made Nkechi's blood run cold. "She is a witness, not a guest," Ji-eun's voice cut through the silence, low and resonant. He didn't look back as he handed his rain-slicked jacket to a waiting attendant, his neck tattoos shimmering under the chandelier's light. "Keep her in the north wing. She does not leave her room without my express command." Mrs. Kwan stepped forward, her heels clicking like a metronome against the floor. "And the rules, Master Lee?" "The usual," he replied, his voice trailing off as he ascended the grand staircase without a backward glance. Mrs. Kwan turned her full, icy attention to Nkechi. "In this house, silence is the only currency of value," she whispered, her voice like a blade. "You will not speak to the staff. You will not touch the walls. You will certainly not look the master in the eye. You are a shadow that has been caught, Nkechi Dimma, and shadows that make noise are deleted." Nkechi gripped the fabric of her skirt, her knuckles white. She had traded the chaos of the Xingu Club for a cage made of gold and silk. As Mrs. Kwan led her down a long, echoing corridor, Nkechi realized that while Ji-eun's whisper had promised protection, his home felt like a beautiful, silent grave. She was no longer an invisible server. She was a captive in a kingdom where the king's mercy was just as terrifying as his wrath. The silence of the Lee estate at 3 in the morning was not peaceful. It was heavy, like the atmospheric pressure before a storm. Nkechi couldn't sleep. The silk sheets of her guest room felt like a taunt against her skin, a reminder of a luxury she hadn't earned and a safety she didn't possess. Driven by a restless thirst, she crept into the hallway, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She found him in the glass-walled gallery overlooking the sleeping city. Ji-eun was slumped in a low leather chair, a half-empty glass of amber liquid sweating on the table beside him. He had discarded his jacket, and his black silk shirt hung open, slipping off one shoulder. In the moonlight, the predatory king of the Xingu syndicate looked smaller, his sharp, angular features softened by a fatigue that bordered on soul deep. Nkechi froze, intending to retreat, but the floor gave a soft, traitorous creak. Ji-eun didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even snap into an alert posture. He simply tilted his head back against the leather, his narrow eyes fluttering open to find her in the shadows. "Can't sleep, little waitress." His voice was a low, sandpaper rasp that vibrated through the quiet room. Nkechi stepped into the light, her gaze drawn irresistibly to the ink crawling up his neck. From a distance, they looked like armor, but up close, she saw the staggering detail. Intertwined thorns, weeping willows, and ancient Korean script that seemed to bleed into his skin. The tattoos didn't just decorate him. They seemed to be holding him together. She moved closer, drawn by a gravity she couldn't explain, until she was standing just inches away. In the silver light, she saw a faint tremor in his hand as he reached for his glass. The piercing, dominant gaze was gone, replaced by a hollow exhaustion that made her chest ache. He wasn't looking at her as a witness or a possession. He was looking at her as if she were the only other living soul in a graveyard. "They say every mark tells a story," Nkechi whispered, her voice barely a breath. Ji-eun let out a dry, hollow laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "In my world, they tell you who you've lost and what you've had to become to survive the losing." He leaned his head back, exposing the vulnerable line of his throat and the bold ink that guarded it. "The city thinks I own everything, Nkechi, but look at this house. It's just a very expensive tomb." In that moment, the power imbalance shifted. The terrifying Mafia boss vanished, leaving behind a man who was clearly the loneliest soul in Seoul. Nkechi realized then that his golden cage wasn't just for her. He had been living in it his entire life. As he closed his eyes again, leaning into the silence, she didn't see a monster. She saw a man drowning in a sea of black ink and silver moonlight. If you have watched up till now, you know the story is interesting, but what you will watch next is much more intriguing. But before then, kindly subscribe to this channel as we bring you the most intriguing Afro-Korean Mafia love stories. Hit the notification bell to get a notification of a new story. Also tap the like button and drop a comment on your thought about the story. If it fascinates you, do well to share it to others. Back to the story. The morning light in the Lee estate didn't shine. It cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows like a cold blade. Mrs. Kwan had appeared at Nkechi's door at dawn, handing her a pair of gray microfiber cloths and a set of keys that felt unnaturally heavy. There was a cruel twist to the older woman's lips as she gestured toward the double doors at the end of the restricted hallway. "The master's study," she had whispered. "Dust every surface. Touch nothing else. If a single page is out of place, I will know." The study was a cathedral of dark wood and silent secrets. It smelled of aged paper, expensive scotch, and the lingering, sharp scent of Ji-eun's cologne. Nkechi worked in a trance, her movements mechanical, her eyes avoiding the high-backed leather chair where she had seen him sitting in her mind's eye all night. She polished the mahogany desk, her reflection in the wood a distorted, deep brown ghost. Then she saw it. A thick, manila folder had been left partially tucked beneath a heavy marble paperweight. On the tab, written in a sterile, corporate font, were two words that made the air vanish from the room: Project Delta. Nkechi's heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. That was the name. It was the phantom phrase her father had muttered in his sleep for months after the banks seized their warehouse in Lagos. It was the name of the investor group that had systematically choked their supply lines until her family was left with nothing but debt and a tarnished name. With trembling fingers, she slid the file out. Her breath hitched as she flipped the cover. Inside were satellite photos of the Lagos port, highlighted in aggressive red ink. There were spreadsheets detailing the liquidation of local competitors and a signature at the bottom of the executive summary that made the world tilt on its axis. It wasn't Ji-eun's signature. The date was from 6 years ago, when he would have been barely more than a soldier, but it was the Shinguk seal. The corporate cleanup that had sent her fleeing across the ocean to become a nameless waitress in Seoul hadn't been a tragedy or a stroke of bad luck. It had been a calculated move on a chessboard she didn't even know existed. The man who had pinned her to the wall, the man who had looked at her with such haunting loneliness in the moonlight, was the heir to the very empire that had fed on her father's life's work. Nkechi clutched the edge of the desk, the microfiber cloth falling unheeded to the floor. The golden cage didn't just have bars, it was built from the wreckage of her own home. She wasn't a guest or even a witness anymore. She was the living evidence of a crime his family had committed, and she was trapped in the heart of the crime scene. I know you're thinking about it right now. She just found out the man protecting her is the one who destroyed her family. So what does she do next? Destroy everything, because she was just a waitress, or turn this truth into power and take everything back? Tell me your choice. The morning mist clung to the Shinguk estate's private garden like a shroud, dampening the scent of manicured peonies and sharp pine. Nkechi stood near a stone lantern, her fingers trembling as she polished the glass. In the 2 weeks she had been confined to the north wing, she had learned to navigate the silence, but the sudden click of designer heels against the gravel shattered the peace like a gunshot. A woman moved through the fog with the grace of a predator. She was draped in ivory silk that screamed of old money and effortless power, her hair a sleek, dark bob that framed a face of porcelain perfection. This was Ji-eun. She didn't look at the flowers. She looked through Nkechi as if she were merely part of the masonry. So, you are the little stray Ji-eun brought home from the gutter, Ji-eun said, her voice a melodic poison. She stopped inches from Nkechi, the scent of her expensive French perfume clashing violently with the damp earth. She reached out, her manicured nail tracing the edge of Nkechi's white apron with a look of profound disgust. A waitress. He always did have a penchant for broken things, but usually, he throws them away once the novelty fades. Nkechi straightened her back, her Nigerian pride warring with the cold reality of her position. I am here under Master Lee's protection, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Ji-eun laughed, a dry, brittle sound. Protection? Is that what he calls it? In this world, we call it a liability. I am the daughter of the Hanseo group, and by the end of the lunar year, I will be the woman wearing the Shinguk crest on my finger. Ji-eun's father and mine shook hands on this before we could walk. You are a footnote in a story you don't even know how to read. She stepped closer, leaning in until her eyes, cold and calculating, were level with Nkechi's. If you think his whispers mean you belong here, remember this. The king may keep a bird in a cage, but he only builds a nest for his queen. And I am the only queen this syndicate will ever accept. Ji-eun turned on her heel, leaving Nkechi alone in the shifting fog. The realization hit Nkechi with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just about surviving a mafia transaction or hiding from an assassin. She was caught in a web of ancient alliances and blood-bound promises. As she looked back at the cold, glass-walled fortress of the estate, she realized she wasn't just a witness anymore. She was a target in a war for a throne she never wanted to sit on. She was in far too deep, and the water was rising. Ji-eun arrives, claiming to be Ji-eun's intended wife. The psychological warfare in the garden and Nkechi's realization that she is in too deep. The afternoon air in the estate's stone courtyard was brittle, tasting of salt and impending rain. Nkechi was attempting to lose herself in the simple, repetitive motion of pruning the winter roses, anything to keep her mind from the Project Delta file that sat like a lead weight in her memory. She didn't hear Choi Hyuk approach. The right-hand man was a shadow given form, his presence signaled only by the sudden, sharp snap of a dry twig under his polished boot. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, his arms crossed over a chest that looked as immovable as a mountain. His eyes, unlike Ji-eun's piercing gaze, were flat and utilitarian, the eyes of a man who saw people as either assets or liabilities. "The master is a sentimental man," Choi Hyuk began, his voice a low, dangerous grate. "He sees a wounded bird and thinks of a pet. I see a leak. I see a girl who was in a room she shouldn't have been in, looking at things that cost millions to keep quiet." He stepped closer, invading Nkechi's personal space until she was forced back against the rough stone of the garden wall. He pulled a small, silver flash drive from his pocket and held it out. "This contains the routing codes for the Shinguk offshore accounts. Take it. Walk out the back gate. There is a car waiting to take you to the airport. You go back to Lagos, and you never speak his name again." Nkechi looked at the drive, then up at his cold, testing expression. It wasn't a gift, it was a trap. If she took it, she was a thief. If she stayed, she was a target. Before she could find her voice, a shadow fell over both of them. The temperature in the courtyard seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ji-eun appeared at the top of the stone stairs, his black silk shirt billowing slightly in the rising wind. He didn't run. He descended with a slow, terrifying deliberation that made the very air feel heavy. "Hyuk," Ji-eun said. The name was a whip crack. Choi Hyuk stiffened, his hand dropping from the flash drive as if it had turned to white-hot iron. He bowed low, his forehead nearly touching his knees. "Boss, I was only—" Ji-eun was suddenly there, moving with the lethal speed Nkechi had seen in the lounge. He didn't strike his man. He simply placed a hand on Choi Hyuk's shoulder. The grip was so tight Nkechi could hear the faint groan of the bodyguard's suit fabric. Ji-eun's jaw was set, his high cheekbones sharp enough to cut, and his eyes were dark voids of absolute authority. "If you ever speak to her without my permission again," Ji-eun whispered, the silence of the courtyard amplifying every syllable, "I will not just remove you from this estate. I will remove you from this world. She is not a guest, and she is not a leak. She is untouchable. Do you understand?" "Yes, boss," Choi Hyuk rasped, his face pale. Ji-eun turned his gaze to Nkechi. The terrifying mask didn't fully drop, but his posture softened by a fraction. He didn't ask if she was okay. His protection was the answer. He reached out, his tattooed thumb grazing the line of her jaw for a fleeting, burning second, marking her in the daylight just as he had claimed her in the dark. In that moment, Nkechi realized that while the cage was made of gold, the man guarding the door was the most dangerous creature she had ever known. The rain finally broke over the estate, drumming against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the private study with the rhythmic violence of a heartbeat. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the cold, metallic tang of the Shinguk Empire. Ji-eun sat behind his mahogany desk, his black silk shirt unbuttoned at the cuffs, his tattooed hands resting motionless on the blotter. He looked like a king at rest, but his narrow eyes tracked Nkechi's every movement as she stepped into the center of the room. She didn't wait for him to speak. She didn't offer the silent, invisible service he was used to. Instead, Nkechi reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a folded, creased piece of paper. A photocopy of the Project Delta executive summary she had risked everything to take. She smoothed it out on the desk between them, her deep brown fingers trembling but her gaze unwavering. "Project Delta," she whispered, the words cutting through the sound of the rain. 6 years ago, Lagos, Nigeria. Ji-eun didn't flinch. He didn't even look down at the paper. He simply watched her, his sharp, angular features hooded in the dim light. "I was a captain in the Southern Districts 6 years ago, Nkechi. I didn't sit in this chair. I didn't sign those papers. But you wear the ring," Nkechi countered, her voice rising with a grief she had suppressed for years. "You own the ink. My father wasn't a criminal. He was a man who built something from nothing, and your investor group strangled him until he had to sell our home just to keep us fed. I didn't come to Seoul for adventure, Ji-eun. I came because your family turned mine into ghosts." The grumpy facade, the icy wall of Mafia indifference he used as armor, finally began to fracture. Ji-eun stood up slowly, his height casting a long, jagged shadow over the desk. He walked around the mahogany edge until he was standing directly in front of her, so close she could see the pulse thrumming in the hollow of his tattooed neck. "You think I don't know the cost of this chair?" he rasped, his voice a low, tortured vibration. He reached out, not to restrain her, but to grip the edge of the desk behind her, trapping her in the heat of his presence. "I spent my youth cleaning up the blood my father spilled. I spent my adulthood trying to turn a butcher shop into a legitimate corporation. I didn't know about Lagos. I didn't know about your father." He leaned in, his piercing gaze softening into something raw and agonized. "But I know now. And I know that the woman I've spent weeks trying to protect is the one person who has every right to see me burn." He didn't offer a hollow apology. He didn't promise to fix the past. He simply stood there, the most powerful man in the city, stripped of his authority by a single sheet of paper and the wide, dark eyes of a waitress who had finally found her voice. For the first time, the heartless boss wasn't answering to his board or his syndicate. He was answering to her. The grand ballroom of the Shinguk Plaza was a sea of shifting silk and predatory smiles, a place where fortunes were traded for secrets under the cold shimmer of 1,000 crystal prisms. Nkechi felt the familiar weight of the white apron against her black dress, her hands steady as she balanced a tray of vintage champagne. Mrs. Kwan had been clear. Tonight, Nkechi was to be a ghost once more, a silent server drifting through the Gala of Shadows, to prove she was nothing more than furniture in June's world. But Lee Ji-eun had other plans. He entered the room like a storm front, his black suit tailored to a lethal edge, the ink on his neck a dark promise against his white collar. He didn't head for the VIP dais or the cluster of waiting board members. Instead, he walked straight through the center of the ballroom, his piercing gaze locked onto the corner where Nkechi stood. The room went silent, a collective intake of breath that made the candlelight flicker. Beside him, Soo-jin stiffened, her designer gown suddenly looking like a costume as Ji-eun reached out. He didn't take a drink from Nkechi's tray. He took the tray from her hands and set it on a passing waiter's station without looking away from her eyes. "You are not serving tonight," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried across the hushed floor. He took her hand, his thumb grazing her deep brown knuckles, and led her toward the center of the dance floor. It wasn't a request, it was a coronation. The Gala of Shadows erupted into a murmur of scandal. To the elite of Seoul, this was more than a dance. It was a declaration of war. By treating a Nigerian waitress like a queen, Ji-eun was spitting on the hierarchy that kept their world turning. The clash happened at the edge of the floor. 3 men from the rival Namgung syndicate stepped forward, their faces twisted in calculated insult. "Is this what the Shinguk king has been hiding?" the leader sneered, reaching out to mockingly flick the lace of Nkechi's apron. "A servant from the streets of Lagos?" He never finished the sentence. Ji-eun moved with the blurred, terrifying speed of a triggered trap. He didn't draw a weapon. He used the sheer force of his hand to slam the man's head into a nearby marble pillar. The sound of bone meeting stone echoed like a gavel. In a heartbeat, the ballroom transformed into a battlefield. Choi Hyuk surged forward, a blur of suppressed gunfire and tactical precision, as Ji-eun pulled Nkechi flush against his chest, shielding her with his own body. "Don't look," He whispered into her hair, his heart drumming a violent, protective rhythm against her ear. Surrounded by the chaos of his enemies and the shattered glass of his reputation, he held her as if she were the only thing in the world worth saving. The heartless boss had finally burned his kingdom down, and as the shadows closed in, Nkechi realized she was the only light he had left. The smoke from the gala's violent disruption had cleared, replaced by the sterile, pre-dawn chill of the high-rise terrace. Below them, Seoul was a carpet of shimmering lights, indifferent to the blood spilled in its ballrooms. Ji-eun stood at the railing, his black suit jacket discarded, his white shirt stained with the iron scent of the night's work. The ink on his neck seemed darker in the moonlight, a map of a life spent in the trenches of power. Nkechi stepped out into the cold, the wind catching the lace of her apron, the last remnant of the invisible server she had fought so hard to be. She didn't stand behind him this time. She walked until her shoulder brushed his, her deep brown skin a striking contrast to the pale marble of the balustrade. "The board will come for you now," she whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still humming in her veins. "You broke their rules. You chose a waitress over a dynasty." Ji-eun turned to her, his sharp, angular features softening in a way that would have terrified his enemies. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger, not the one from his study, but a new one, stamped with the seal of a private trust. "I didn't choose a waitress," he rasped, his narrow eyes locking onto hers with a gaze that was no longer dominant, but devastatingly honest. "I chose the only person who saw the man beneath the ink. Project Delta is dead, Nkechi. I've spent the last 4 hours liquidating the subsidiaries that choked your father's business. The capital is being transferred to Lagos tonight." He placed the ledger in her hands, his tattooed fingers lingering over hers. "It won't give you back the 6 years you lost, but it will give your father his name back, and it will give you the seat you were always meant to have." Nkechi looked down at the documents, the weight of her family's restored future settling in her palms. She looked back at the man who had started as her captor and ended as her shield. The heartless boss was gone, replaced by a king who had finally found something worth more than his empire. "Why?" she asked, her breath hitching. Ji-eun stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb grazing her full lips. "Because you told me to trust you," he murmured, leaning in until their foreheads rested together. "And for the first time in my life, the air doesn't feel like a tomb." They stood there as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, no longer a master and a servant, but a king and his chosen anchor. The golden cage had finally been dismantled, and as the light hit the glass of the estate behind them, they didn't look back. They looked toward a horizon where their pasts no longer defined them, and their future was a script they would write together, one honest word at a time. This story explores the transformative power of vulnerability and redemption. Ji-eun dismantles his ruthless corporate empire, the Golden Cage, to restore the justice Nkechi's family lost. By choosing her over his dynasty, he transitions from a heartless boss to a man seeking genuine connection. It shows that true power isn't found in dominance or wealth, but in the courage to be seen and the integrity to right past wrongs. Their bond proves that when we move beyond societal masks, we find a future defined by choice rather than circumstance. Kindly subscribe to this channel as we bring you the most intriguing Afro-Korean Mafia love stories. Hit the notification bell to get a notification of a new story. Also tap the like button and drop a comment on your thought about the story. If it fascinates you, do well to share it to others. I give you my purple heart. Cheers.